When Staff Sergeant Juliet Parks stepped out of the shadows of Hangar 7 at Miramar Naval Air Station, her grease-stained coveralls and oil-streaked face told the story everyone expected to see. Just another mechanic finishing another late-night shift on the Navy's most elite fighter jets. But as Lieutenant Commander Jake Viper Thompson and his squadron prepared for the most dangerous training exercise in decades, none of them could have imagined that the quiet woman they barely acknowledged possessed skills that would soon make the difference between life and death at 40,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The California sun hadn't yet broken through the marine layer that cloaked Miramar Naval Air Station in its early morning embrace, but Staff Sergeant Juliet Parks was already 3 hours into her workday. The massive hangar echoed with the distinctive hum of hydraulic systems and the occasional clang of tools against metal as she performed her meticulous pre-dawn inspection of the FA-18 Super Hornets that would soon carry the Navy's finest pilots into another day of intensive training. At 28, Juliet possessed an almost mystical understanding of these million-dollar war machines. Her calloused hands moved across control surfaces and engine components, with the confidence of someone who could diagnose problems that computer systems missed and predict failures before they happened. The other mechanics had dubbed her Ghost not because she was invisible, but because she seemed to appear wherever aircraft problems materialized, solving complex technical issues with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural. Juliet's reputation among the maintenance crew was built on results that spoke louder than words. When Hornet 204 developed an intermittent hydraulic issue that had stumped 3 different technical teams, Juliet spent a single night with the aircraft and emerged the next morning with a solution that had everyone shaking their heads in amazement. When the squadron's newest Super Hornet began experiencing subtle vibrations that its computer systems couldn't identify, Juliet traced the problem to a manufacturing defect so minute that it required specialized equipment to detect. Her maintenance logs read like technical poetry, documenting not just what she had repaired but providing detailed analysis of why systems failed and how similar problems could be prevented in the future. The base's maintenance officers had learned to pay attention when Elena Rodriguez flagged potential issues, because her track record of accurate predictions had saved the Navy millions of dollars and prevented aircraft damage and avoided mission failures. But Juliet's expertise came with a price that she paid in solitude and misunderstanding. While other maintenance personnel gathered in groups during breaks, sharing stories and building the camaraderie that sustained military life, Juliet remained apart, her attention focused on technical manuals and aircraft systems, with an intensity that others found almost unsettling. She ate lunch alone, worked overtime without complaint, and maintained a professional distance that kept her colleagues from getting too close. The pilots who flew the aircraft she maintained knew her only as a name on maintenance reports and a figure in coveralls who occasionally emerged from beneath their jets to hand them clipboard signatures. To Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson, the squadron's commanding officer and one of the Navy's most decorated combat pilots, Juliet Parks was simply another competent technician whose job was to ensure his F/A-18 Super Hornet functioned perfectly when he needed it to perform. Thompson had earned his call sign Viper through a combination of aggressive flying and tactical brilliance that had made him a legend among naval aviators. At 32, he commanded respect not just for his combat experience in 2 overseas deployments, but for his ability to push advanced aircraft to their absolute limits while maintaining the precision necessary for successful mission completion. His pilots looked up to him as someone who embodied everything the Navy wanted in its elite aviators. The morning briefing took place in the squadron's ready room, where pilots gathered around tactical displays showing their planned training exercises for the day. Thompson outlined their mission with the confident authority of someone who had successfully completed similar operations dozens of times before. They would be conducting advanced air-to-air combat training, simulating engagements against enemy aircraft using tactics and maneuvers that pushed both pilots and machines to their operational boundaries. Today's exercise will test everything we've learned about modern air combat, Thompson announced to his assembled pilots, his flight suit bearing patches from multiple elite training programs and combat deployments. We'll be flying against simulated adversaries using the most advanced tactics our intelligence services have identified in current threat environments. This isn't routine training, gentlemen. This is preparation for real-world scenarios where split-second decisions determine mission success and pilot survival. The pilots nodded with the confident understanding of professionals who had trained for exactly these kinds of challenging scenarios. Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Martinez, Thompson's most trusted wingman, reviewed weather data that showed clear skies and ideal flying conditions. Lieutenant Mark Bulldog Williams, the squadron's weapons systems specialist, confirmed that all aircraft were loaded with training ordnance and configured for maximum combat effectiveness. What none of the pilots discussed during their briefing was the maintenance report that Juliet Parks had filed the previous evening, documenting subtle anomalies in the flight control systems of 3 different aircraft. Her analysis suggested that recent modifications to the Super Hornet software had created minor inconsistencies in how the aircraft responded to pilot inputs under high-stress maneuvering conditions. The variations were well within acceptable parameters and posed no immediate safety risks, but Elena's experience suggested they could become problematic during the kind of aggressive flying that combat training demanded. Juliet had spent the previous week analyzing flight data from similar aircraft, looking for patterns that might indicate how the software modifications were affecting aircraft performance. Her investigation had revealed correlations between pilot control inputs and aircraft responses that suggested the modifications were creating delays in critical flight systems. The delays were measured in milliseconds and would be unnoticeable during routine flying, but Juliet understood that combat maneuvering required precision timing that could be compromised by even tiny system delays. Her maintenance recommendations had been filed through proper channels and forwarded to the appropriate technical authorities, but the response had been predictably bureaucratic. The modifications had been tested and approved by engineers who understood theoretical aircraft performance, but Juliet's concerns were based on practical experience with how these systems behaved under the extreme conditions that combat flying demanded. Her warnings had been acknowledged, filed, and essentially ignored by decision-makers who saw no immediate need to ground aircraft for problems that existed only on paper. As the pilots completed their briefing and prepared for their mission, Juliet continued her pre-flight inspections with the methodical precision that had made her indispensable to squadron operations. She checked hydraulic systems, verified weapons configurations, and examined flight control surfaces with the attention to detail that had prevented countless mechanical failures over her years of service. But beneath her professional calm, Juliet carried the growing certainty that today's aggressive training exercises would reveal the problems she had identified in ways that could transform minor technical issues into life-threatening emergencies. The irony of Juliet's situation wasn't lost on her as she watched the pilots stride toward their aircraft with the confident swagger that marked elite naval aviators. These men and women were among the most skilled pilots in the world, capable of flying complex missions that required split-second decision-making and absolute mastery of advanced aircraft systems. But their confidence was based on assumptions about aircraft performance that Juliet knew were no longer entirely accurate, and their trust in their machines was about to be tested in ways that their training had never prepared them to handle. Juliet's solitary lunch break was spent reviewing technical data and weather forecasts, analyzing information that painted a picture of increasing complexity for the afternoon's training mission. The weather conditions that looked perfect for flying would actually create atmospheric pressures and temperature variations that could exacerbate the flight control issues she had identified. The training scenarios that Thompson had outlined would push the aircraft into exactly the flight regimes where software delays became most problematic. As Juliet prepared to sign off on the final pre-flight inspections, she made a decision that reflected both her technical expertise and her growing concern for pilot safety. She would monitor the training mission from the Maintenance Control Center, tracking aircraft performance data in real time, to watch for signs that her predicted problems were developing. If the flight control issues materialized as she expected, Juliet would be positioned to provide the technical support that could make the difference between successful mission completion and potential disaster. What Juliet couldn't predict was that today's training mission would push her own carefully maintained cover to its breaking point, forcing her to reveal capabilities that would transform how everyone at Miramar understood both her identity and her true value to naval aviation operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Lieutenant Commander Jake Viper Thompson stood in the maintenance bay reviewing the pre-flight checklist for his F/A-18 Super Hornet, his polished flight boots clicking against the concrete floor as he conducted his walk-around inspection. The aircraft gleamed under the hangar's fluorescent lights, every surface reflecting the meticulous care that the maintenance crew provided to these multi-million-dollar war machines. But Thompson's attention was focused on performance specifications and mission parameters, rather than the technical expertise that kept his aircraft operational. "Parks," Thompson called out as Juliet emerged from beneath the aircraft's starboard wing, wiping hydraulic fluid from her hands with a shop rag. "I see you flagged some concerns about flight control response times in your maintenance report. Care to explain what kind of issues we're talking about?" Juliet looked up from her clipboard, noting the skeptical tone in Thompson's voice that suggested he was asking for clarification rather than genuinely seeking her technical assessment. She had encountered this attitude from pilots throughout her career. The assumption that maintenance personnel understood mechanical systems but lacked the broader knowledge necessary to evaluate aircraft performance under operational conditions. "Sir, the recent software modifications have introduced microsecond delays in the flight control system's response to pilot inputs," Juliet explained, her voice carrying the precise technical language that marked her expertise. "During routine flying operations, these delays are negligible and won't affect aircraft performance. However, during high-stress combat maneuvering, particularly at altitude and under significant G-forces, these delays could accumulate and create response lag that might compromise pilot control authority." Thompson's expression shifted from skeptical interest to barely concealed irritation as he processed Juliet's explanation. In his experience, maintenance personnel who offered unsolicited opinions about flight operations were usually overstepping their expertise, confusing theoretical technical knowledge with practical understanding of how aircraft performed in real-world conditions. "Parks, I appreciate your attention to detail," Thompson replied with the patronizing patience that officers often used when addressing enlisted personnel who had exceeded their perceived authority. "But these software modifications were tested extensively by naval aviation engineers who understand flight dynamics better than anyone. If there were genuine performance issues, don't you think they would have been identified during the certification process?" The question was rhetorical, designed to remind Juliet of her place in the military hierarchy rather than to genuinely solicit her professional opinion. Thompson's tone conveyed his belief that maintenance specialists should focus on mechanical systems and leave flight performance assessments to qualified pilots and engineers. Juliet felt the familiar frustration of someone whose expertise was being dismissed due to assumptions about her role and qualifications. She understood aircraft systems at a level that went far beyond routine maintenance, but explaining the source of that knowledge would require revealing information that her current assignment specifically prohibited her from sharing. "Sir, I understand the certification process was thorough," Juliet replied diplomatically, maintaining the respectful tone that military protocol required when addressing superior officers. "However, my analysis of recent flight data shows patterns that suggest the modifications are creating cumulative effects that may not have been apparent during individual test flights. The delays become more pronounced under the specific conditions you'll encounter during today's training exercise." Thompson's patience was clearly wearing thin as he listened to what he perceived as a maintenance technician attempting to lecture him about flight operations. His combat experience and advanced training had taught him to trust aircraft systems that had been properly tested and certified, and he found Juliet's concerns to be the kind of overcautious analysis that could ground perfectly functional aircraft based on theoretical problems. "Look, Parks," Thompson said with the tone of someone ending a conversation that had already lasted longer than he considered necessary. "I've been flying these aircraft for over a decade, including combat missions where mechanical reliability meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. These systems are designed by the best engineers in the world and tested under conditions more extreme than anything we'll encounter during training exercises." Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Martinez, who had been conducting her own pre-flight inspection nearby, overheard the conversation and approached with the diplomatic skills that had made her Thompson's most trusted wingman. She recognized that the discussion was becoming more contentious than necessary, but she also understood Thompson's frustration with maintenance personnel who seemed to question the judgment of experienced pilots. "Sir," Martinez interjected smoothly, "maybe we should document Parks' concerns in the mission briefing notes so that all pilots are aware of the potential issues she's identified. Even if the problems don't materialize, having additional situational awareness never hurts mission preparation." Thompson considered Martinez's suggestion, recognizing it as a reasonable compromise that would address Juliet's concerns without acknowledging that her technical analysis might be superior to official engineering assessments. The approach would allow him to demonstrate appropriate consideration for maintenance input while maintaining his authority as mission commander. Fine, Thompson agreed with the air of someone making a concession to keep operations moving smoothly. Parks, summarize your concerns in writing and I'll include them in the pilot briefing as additional information. But understand that these aircraft have been cleared for all training operations, and I'm not going to modify mission parameters based on theoretical problems that exist only in maintenance logs. Juliet nodded professionally, understanding that she had pushed as far as military protocol would allow without creating conflicts that could undermine her carefully maintained cover. Her technical concerns were legitimate and based on analysis that went far beyond routine maintenance knowledge, but explaining the depth of her expertise would require revealing capabilities that her assignment specifically prohibited her from acknowledging. As Thompson walked away to continue his pre-flight preparations, he found himself reflecting on the interaction with a mixture of annoyance and grudging respect. Parks was clearly dedicated to her work and possessed technical knowledge that exceeded most maintenance personnel, but her tendency to offer unsolicited opinions about flight operations struck him as inappropriate overreach of her professional boundaries. "Phoenix, what do you make of Parks' concerns?" Thompson asked Martinez as they reviewed their mission planning documents. "She seems to think these software modifications are going to cause control problems during aggressive maneuvering, but the aircraft have been flying perfectly since the updates were installed." Martinez considered the question carefully, drawing on her own experience with maintenance personnel who had varying levels of technical expertise and professional judgment. She had learned to distinguish between overcautious technicians who saw problems everywhere and genuinely knowledgeable specialists whose concerns were based on legitimate technical analysis. "Sir, Parks has a reputation for being extremely thorough in her analysis," Martinez replied diplomatically. "The other maintenance personnel respect her technical judgment, and her maintenance logs are consistently the most detailed and accurate documents that come through operations. If she's concerned about something, it's probably worth taking seriously even if we don't fully understand her reasoning." Thompson appreciated Martinez's balanced perspective, but his own experience had taught him to trust aircraft systems that had been properly tested and certified by official authorities. Parks' concerns might reflect genuine technical knowledge, but they were also the kind of theoretical problems that could ground functional aircraft if taken too seriously. "I understand your point, Phoenix," Thompson replied, "but we can't start modifying mission parameters every time maintenance personnel identify potential issues that exist only in computer models and flight data analysis. These aircraft are designed to handle the kind of flying we're planning for today, and the pilots in this squadron are trained to manage any technical problems that might develop during operations." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Tank Johnson, the senior enlisted advisor whose experience with naval aviation maintenance spanned over 20 years and multiple aircraft types. Johnson had earned his nickname through a combination of physical presence and uncompromising standards that had made him legendary among maintenance personnel throughout the fleet. "Lieutenant Commander, I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about Parks' flight control concerns," Johnson said with the respectful directness that marked senior enlisted personnel addressing commissioned officers. "Sir, I've worked with a lot of maintenance specialists over the years, and Parks has technical knowledge that goes beyond what you'd normally expect from someone at her rank and experience level." Thompson looked at Johnson with interest, recognizing that the Master Chief's assessment carried significant weight due to his extensive experience evaluating maintenance personnel across different commands and aircraft types. Johnson's endorsement of Parks' capabilities suggested that her concerns might be based on expertise that wasn't immediately apparent from her personnel file or current assignment. "Master Chief, what specifically makes Parks different from other maintenance specialists?" Thompson asked, genuinely curious about Johnson's perspective on someone whose technical analysis seemed to exceed normal expectations for her position. Johnson considered his response carefully, aware that his assessment of Parks would influence how Thompson and other pilots viewed her recommendations in the future. He had observed Parks' work for several months and had noted technical capabilities that seemed to indicate experience and training that went beyond standard maintenance specialization. "Sir, Parks understands aircraft systems at a level that suggests formal engineering education or extensive operational experience," Johnson replied thoughtfully. "Her analysis of technical problems considers factors that most maintenance personnel wouldn't even think to examine. When she identifies potential issues, her predictions have been accurate enough that I've learned to take her recommendations seriously, even when I don't fully understand her reasoning." The Master Chief's assessment gave Thompson pause as he reconsidered his dismissal of Parks' concerns about the flight control modifications. Johnson's experience and judgment were beyond question, and his endorsement of Parks' technical capabilities suggested that her warnings might be based on legitimate expertise rather than overcautious analysis. However, Thompson's training and experience had taught him to rely on official certification processes and established protocols rather than individual assessments, regardless of how knowledgeable those individuals might be. The aircraft had been cleared for all training operations by competent authorities, and modifying mission parameters based on theoretical concerns could set dangerous precedents for operational decision-making. "I appreciate your input, Master Chief," Thompson said finally. "But unless Parks can provide specific evidence of actual system failures or safety hazards, I'm not prepared to modify today's training mission based on potential problems that exist only in maintenance data analysis. These aircraft are cleared for the operations we're planning, and the pilots in this squadron are trained to handle any technical issues that might develop." As the pre-flight preparations continued, Juliet returned to her workstation with the frustrated understanding that her technical warnings had been acknowledged but not seriously considered by the pilots who would be depending on the aircraft systems she had analyzed. Her expertise told her that today's aggressive training exercises would reveal the problems she had identified, but military protocol prevented her from taking more direct action to ensure pilot safety. The irony of her situation was becoming increasingly apparent as she watched Thompson and his squadron prepare for a mission that would test their aircraft in exactly the ways that made her concerns most relevant. The quiet maintenance specialist, whose warnings had been politely dismissed, possessed knowledge and experience that could prevent the kind of emergencies that were about to unfold, but her carefully maintained cover meant that her true capabilities would remain hidden until crisis made them impossible to ignore. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Radar Williams had been working alongside Juliet Parks for 8 months, but he realized he knew almost nothing about the woman who had earned a reputation as the most skilled maintenance specialist at Miramar. Unlike other enlisted personnel who shared stories about their backgrounds, previous assignments, and personal lives during breaks and after-shift gatherings, Juliet remained professionally cordial but personally distant in ways that seemed deliberate rather than antisocial. "Parks is like a ghost who happens to be really good with aircraft," Williams mentioned to aviation machinists mate Second Class Lisa Chen during their lunch break in the maintenance facility's break room. "She shows up, fixes problems that stump everyone else, files the most detailed reports I've ever seen, and then disappears until the next crisis needs solving." Chen nodded thoughtfully as she considered Williams' observation about their enigmatic colleague. She had noticed the same pattern of professional excellence combined with personal isolation that marked Juliet's daily routine. Unlike typical military personnel who formed close bonds with their unit members, Juliet maintained relationships that were respectful but carefully bounded, never allowing casual interactions to develop into genuine friendships. "What gets me," Chen replied, "is that she understands these aircraft better than people who've been working on them for twice as long. Yesterday, she diagnosed an intermittent avionics problem in Hornet 312 by listening to engine sounds that the rest of us couldn't even hear. When the computer diagnostics finally caught up with her assessment, she'd already identified the exact component that needed replacement." The conversation reflected a growing curiosity among the maintenance crew about Juliet's background and the source of her exceptional technical knowledge. Her personnel file listed standard maintenance training at various Navy technical schools, but her practical expertise suggested experience and education that went far beyond conventional enlisted specialization. Aviation electronics technician Second Class David Sparks Rodriguez had conducted his own informal investigation into Juliet's background, driven by professional curiosity rather than personal nosiness. His access to maintenance databases and technical records had revealed patterns in Juliet's work that raised interesting questions about her previous assignments and training. "I've been looking at Parks' maintenance logs from the past year," Rodriguez told Williams and Chen with the excitement of someone who had discovered an intriguing puzzle. "Her diagnostic accuracy rate is 97%, which is higher than most senior chiefs with 20 years of experience. But here's the weird part. Her techniques and analytical methods don't match any standard Navy maintenance training program." The 3 maintenance specialists found themselves speculating about Juliet's mysterious background with the kind of interest that military personnel typically reserved for particularly challenging technical problems. Her combination of exceptional competence and deliberate privacy had created an air of mystery that made her more fascinating than typical colleagues who shared their life stories freely. Maybe she's some kind of civilian contractor who got brought into the Navy through a special program, Williams suggested. I've heard about engineers and technical specialists who get fast-tracked into military positions when they have expertise that the services need. Chen shook her head skeptically as she considered Williams' theory about Juliet's possible civilian background. No way. Parks knows military protocol too well to be a recent civilian conversion. She understands naval aviation culture and procedures, like someone who's been in the system for years. But there's something about the way she carries herself that suggests experience beyond routine maintenance work. Rodriguez leaned forward with the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing classified information, though his speculation was based entirely on publicly available maintenance records and professional observations. What if Parks is some kind of undercover investigator? Maybe she's here to evaluate maintenance procedures or investigate security issues that require someone with advanced technical knowledge. The speculation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Chief Johnson, whose presence immediately shifted the conversation from casual theorizing to professional attention. The senior enlisted leader's expression suggested that he had business to discuss, rather than personal interest in joining their lunch break conversation. Williams, Chen, Rodriguez, Johnson said with the authoritative tone that marked his interactions with junior personnel. I need to discuss maintenance scheduling for this afternoon's training mission, and I want to make sure everyone understands the importance of monitoring aircraft performance data during flight operations. The three maintenance specialists straightened their posture and gave Johnson their complete attention, recognizing that his serious demeanor indicated more than routine administrative matters. The Master Chief's emphasis on performance monitoring suggested that he shared some of the concerns that Juliet had expressed about the flight control modifications. Master Chief, Williams asked respectfully, are we expecting specific problems with the aircraft during today's mission? Parks mentioned some concerns about flight control response times, but Lieutenant Commander Thompson seemed to think the issues were theoretical rather than practical. Johnson's expression revealed his own conflicted feelings about the situation developing between Juliet's technical warnings and the pilot's confidence in their aircraft systems. His extensive experience had taught him to recognize when maintenance personnel possessed legitimate expertise that exceeded their apparent qualifications, but military protocol required him to support operational decisions made by commissioned officers. Parks has identified potential issues with the recent software modifications that could affect aircraft performance under extreme maneuvering conditions, Johnson explained carefully. While the pilots have determined that these concerns don't warrant mission modifications, I want all maintenance personnel monitoring telemetry data closely during flight operations to watch for any anomalies that might develop. Chen understood the subtext of Johnson's instructions, recognizing that the Master Chief was positioning the maintenance crew to provide technical support if Juliet's predictions proved accurate during the training mission. The approach allowed Johnson to respect the pilot's operational authority, while ensuring that technical expertise would be available if problems materialized. Master Chief, what makes Parks so much better at this stuff than the rest of us? Rodriguez asked with genuine curiosity rather than competitive resentment. Her technical analysis goes way beyond anything we learned in maintenance school, and she seems to understand flight operations better than most people who work on aircraft systems. Johnson paused thoughtfully as he considered how to respond to Rodriguez's question without revealing information that might compromise operational security or violate Juliet's privacy. His own observations of Parks had raised similar questions about her background and qualifications, but his position required him to focus on performance rather than speculation about personnel histories. Parks brings a unique combination of technical knowledge and analytical skills to her maintenance work, Johnson replied diplomatically. Sometimes people develop expertise through experience and study that goes beyond their formal training records. What matters is that her technical assessments have been consistently accurate, and her recommendations have prevented several potential problems that could have resulted in mission failures or safety hazards. The Master Chief's carefully worded response satisfied Rodriguez's curiosity while maintaining the professional boundaries that military service required. Johnson understood that Parks possessed capabilities that seemed to exceed her apparent qualifications, but his responsibility was to utilize her expertise effectively rather than investigate the sources of her knowledge. As the maintenance crew prepared to return to their afternoon duties, Williams found himself thinking about the contrast between Parks' mysterious background and her obvious competence. The woman who kept her personal history carefully hidden was also the person that everyone turned to when aircraft problems required the kind of technical expertise that went beyond routine maintenance procedures. "You know what I think?" Williams said to his colleagues as they walked back toward the maintenance bay. "I think Parks used to do something else before she got assigned here. Something that required the kind of advanced technical knowledge she demonstrates every day. Maybe she was an instructor or an engineer or worked on experimental aircraft programs." Chen nodded agreement with Williams' assessment, though she suspected that the truth about Parks's background might be more complex than simple career transition. Whatever she did before, she's definitely overqualified for routine maintenance work. The question is why someone with her capabilities ended up in a position that doesn't fully utilize her expertise. The speculation was cut short by their return to the maintenance bay, where Juliet was already preparing for the afternoon's flight operations by reviewing telemetry systems and communication protocols. Her methodical approach to monitoring equipment suggested that she was positioning herself to track aircraft performance data in real time during the training mission. "Parks," Williams called out as they rejoined their colleague, "Master Chief says we should all be monitoring flight data extra carefully during today's mission. Are you expecting the control system problems you identified to show up during the exercise?" Juliet looked up from her equipment preparations with an expression that combined professional concern with personal frustration about the limitations of her current role. She understood aircraft systems and pilot capabilities well enough to predict how the day's training mission would unfold, but her carefully maintained cover prevented her from explaining the full extent of her knowledge. "The flight control delays I've identified will become most apparent during high-stress maneuvering at altitude," Juliet replied with the precise technical language that marked her expertise. "If the pilots encounter situations that require rapid control inputs and immediate aircraft response, the accumulated delays could create problems that develop faster than normal emergency procedures can handle." Her response carried an undertone of certainty that suggested knowledge based on more than theoretical analysis, but Williams and his colleagues attributed her confidence to the exceptional technical expertise that had already made her legendary among the maintenance crew. What none of them realized was that Juliet's predictions about the training mission were based on personal experience with similar aircraft under similar conditions, experience that her current assignment required her to keep hidden even when that knowledge could prevent the kind of emergencies that were about to unfold above the Pacific Ocean. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Miramar flight line as Lieutenant Commander Thompson and his squadron of F/A-18 Super Hornets prepared for takeoff. The sleek gray fighters sat poised on the tarmac like predatory birds, their engines warming up with the distinctive whine that marks some of the most advanced combat aircraft ever built. Ground crews performed final checks while pilots completed their pre-flight rituals, each man and woman focused on the complex training mission that would push both aircraft and aviators to their operational limits. In the air traffic control tower, Commander Patricia Hawk Sullivan assumed her position as mission controller, overseeing what promised to be one of the most challenging training exercises conducted at Miramar in recent months. Sullivan's 22 years of naval aviation experience had taught her to recognize the subtle differences between routine training flights and missions that carried genuine risks due to their complexity and demanding nature. "Tower, this is Viper Flight requesting clearance for departure." Thompson's voice crackled through the communication system with the confident authority that marked elite naval aviators. "We have 4 Super Hornets configured for advanced air-to-air combat training, estimated mission duration 3 hours, with multiple engagement scenarios." Sullivan reviewed her flight operations board, noting weather conditions that showed perfect visibility and minimal wind, but also atmospheric pressure variations that could affect aircraft performance at high altitudes. The meteorological data suggested ideal flying conditions for most operations, but she noticed subtle patterns that experienced controllers learned to monitor when aircraft would be operating at extreme performance levels. "Viper Flight, you are cleared for departure runway 24 right," Sullivan responded professionally. "Be advised that upper-level atmospheric conditions show some variability that may affect high-altitude operations. Contact departure control on frequency 254.8 after takeoff." In the maintenance control center, Juliet had positioned herself at a monitoring station, equipped with real-time telemetry systems that would allow her to track aircraft performance data throughout the training mission. Her workstation displayed multiple screens showing engine parameters, flight control responses, and system status indicators for each aircraft in Thompson's squadron. The setup represented the most comprehensive monitoring capability available to maintenance personnel during flight operations. Master Chief Johnson approached Juliet's workstation with the purposeful stride that indicated official business rather than casual conversation. His expression carried the weight of someone who understood that the afternoon's training mission might validate concerns that had been officially dismissed but professionally respected by experienced enlisted personnel. "Parks, I want you monitoring flight data continuously during this mission," Johnson instructed with the gravity that marked his most serious operational directives. "If you see any patterns that suggest the flight control issues you identified are developing, I want immediate notification regardless of what the pilots are reporting about aircraft status." Juliet nodded her understanding of Johnson's instructions, recognizing that the Master Chief was positioning her to provide technical support that might become critical if her predictions about the software modifications proved accurate. The arrangement represented an unofficial acknowledgement of her expertise that operated parallel to the formal chain of command. "Master Chief, I'll be tracking control system response times and looking for the cumulative delay patterns that become most apparent during aggressive maneuvering," Juliet replied with the professional confidence that had made her indispensable to squadron operations. "If problems develop, they'll likely manifest first as subtle timing issues that pilots might interpret as normal aircraft behavior under stress." 20 miles offshore, Thompson's squadron assumed their training formation at 25,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, where crystal-clear skies and unlimited visibility created ideal conditions for the complex air-to-air combat scenarios they were about to execute. The 4 Super Hornets moved through the sky with the precision choreography that marked elite naval aviation, each pilot maintaining perfect position while preparing for the aggressive maneuvering that would test both their skills and their aircraft's capabilities. "Viper Flight, this is Hawk Control," Commander Sullivan's voice transmitted to the formation. "You are cleared to commence training exercise Alpha 7. Simulated adversary aircraft will be approaching from the northeast at Angels 35. Rules of engagement are weapons training mode. Maintain safe separation standards throughout all maneuvers." Thompson acknowledged the transmission while simultaneously reviewing his tactical displays and preparing for the kind of high-intensity flying that had made naval aviation legendary among military services worldwide. The training scenario would simulate multiple enemy aircraft attacking his formation, requiring defensive maneuvers and counterattacks that pushed both pilots and machines to their absolute limits. "Phoenix, Bulldog, Cobra," Thompson transmitted to his 3 wingmen using their call signs. "Remember that today's exercise is designed to replicate the most challenging combat scenarios our intelligence services have identified. These maneuvers will test aircraft systems under conditions that exceed normal operational parameters." Lieutenant Martinez acknowledged Thompson's briefing while checking her own aircraft systems, noting that all indicators showed normal operation despite the concerns that Parks had raised about flight control modifications. Her Super Hornet responded perfectly to control inputs, with no apparent delays or anomalies that might suggest developing problems. The first engagement began with simulated enemy aircraft approaching from multiple directions, forcing Thompson's formation to execute the kind of radical defensive maneuvering that required split-second pilot decisions and immediate aircraft response. The Super Hornets twisted through the sky in violent turns and climbs that subjected both airframes and flight control systems to stresses that revealed the true capabilities of these advanced war machines. In the Maintenance Control Center, Juliet watched her monitoring screens with growing concern as telemetry data began showing the first subtle signs of the problems she had predicted. The flight control system delays were minimal and well within normal parameters, but her trained eye could see patterns developing that suggested the cumulative effects she had warned about were beginning to manifest under the stress of combat maneuvering. "Control response times are starting to show variation," Juliet reported to the duty maintenance officer, who was monitoring operations from a nearby workstation. "Still within acceptable limits, but the patterns suggest that delays are accumulating as pilots execute high-G maneuvers at altitude." The duty officer, Aviation Electronics Technician Chief Warrant Officer Michael Scope Patterson, moved to Juliet's workstation to examine the data she was tracking. Patterson's 15 years of experience with aircraft systems had taught him to recognize when subtle technical indicators might predict more significant problems, and Juliet's reputation for accurate analysis made her concerns worth serious consideration. "What exactly are you seeing, Parks?" Patterson asked as he studied the telemetry displays showing aircraft performance data from Thompson's formation. "The pilots aren't reporting any control problems, and all aircraft systems appear to be functioning normally." Juliet pointed to specific data streams on her monitors, highlighting correlations between pilot control inputs and aircraft responses that showed microscopic delays accumulating during periods of aggressive maneuvering. The variations were barely detectable and wouldn't be apparent to pilots who were focused on tactical situations rather than technical performance metrics. "Chief, the flight control computers are taking longer to process pilot inputs during high-stress maneuvers," Juliet explained with the precision that marked her technical assessments. "The delays are measured in milliseconds and aren't noticeable during individual maneuvers, but they're creating a cumulative lag that could become problematic if pilots encounter situations requiring immediate aircraft response." Meanwhile, at 30,000 feet above the Pacific, Thompson was beginning to notice subtle changes in his aircraft's behavior that didn't match his expectations based on thousands of hours of experience flying Super Hornets. The differences were so minor that he initially attributed them to atmospheric conditions or the stress of executing complex maneuvers, but the patterns were consistent enough to catch his attention. "Phoenix, are you noticing any unusual flight characteristics during these high-G turns?" Thompson asks his wingman during a brief lull between engagement scenarios. "My aircraft seems to be responding just slightly differently than normal. Nothing dangerous, but not quite what I'd expect." Martinez considered Thompson's question while executing a climbing turn that tested her own aircraft's response characteristics. She had noticed similar, subtle differences in how her Super Hornet was handling extreme maneuvers, but like Thompson, she had initially dismissed them as normal variations under challenging flight conditions. "Lead, I'm seeing some minor response differences as well," Martinez replied thoughtfully. "Nothing that affects flight safety, but the aircraft does seem to be handling just slightly off nominal during the most aggressive maneuvering sequences." The conversation between Thompson and Martinez represented the first acknowledgement that the flight control issues Juliet had identified were beginning to manifest during actual flight operations. The pilot's observations confirmed that her technical analysis had been accurate, but the problems remained subtle enough that they posed no immediate danger to flight safety. Back in the Maintenance Control Center, Juliet's monitoring equipment was painting an increasingly clear picture of developing issues that would likely become more pronounced as the training mission continued. The flight control delays were following exactly the patterns she had predicted, accumulating during periods of high stress and creating response characteristics that differed from normal aircraft behavior. "Chief Patterson," Juliet said with growing urgency, "recommend we contact the flight and advise them to monitor their control systems closely. The delays I'm tracking are approaching thresholds where they could affect pilot ability to recover from unusual attitudes or emergency situations." Patterson weighed Juliet's recommendation against military protocols that discouraged maintenance personnel from interrupting flight operations unless clear safety hazards were identified. The problems she was tracking remained within technically acceptable parameters, but her proven accuracy in predicting aircraft issues made her concerns worth serious consideration. The training mission was about to enter its most challenging phase, with combat scenarios that would push both pilots and aircraft systems to their absolute limits. Neither Thompson nor his squadron could predict that the subtle flight control issues they were beginning to notice would soon escalate into the kind of emergency that would test every aspect of their training and force them to confront the limitations of their assumptions about the quiet maintenance specialist who had tried to warn them. 40 minutes into the training mission, Lieutenant Commander Thompson found himself in the most intense air-to-air combat simulation he had experienced in years. The exercise had escalated from routine formation maneuvers to a complex multi-threat scenario that required his squadron to engage simulated enemy aircraft attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously. At 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, the 4 Super Hornets twisted through the sky in violent defensive maneuvers that pushed both pilot skills and aircraft systems far beyond normal operational limits. Viper-led Tally 4 bandits approaching from the northwest, Angels 38. Lieutenant Bulldog Williams called out over the radio as his radar systems identified incoming simulated threats. "They're coming in fast and low, looks like a coordinated attack pattern designed to overwhelm our defensive capabilities." Thompson acknowledged the threat call while simultaneously executing a climbing spiral that subjected his aircraft to forces exceeding 7 gigaseconds, causing his flight suit to inflate as life support systems worked to maintain blood flow during the extreme maneuver. But as he attempted to level off and acquire the simulated targets, his Super Hornet's response felt subtly wrong in ways that his experience couldn't immediately explain. The aircraft was responding to his control inputs, but with a delay that created a disconnect between his intentions and the machine's actual behavior. The sensation was similar to flying in turbulence or dealing with control system degradation. But the sky was perfectly clear, and all his instruments showed normal system status. Something was interfering with the precise aircraft control that combat maneuvering demanded. "Phoenix, I'm experiencing some kind of control lag during high-G maneuvers," Thompson transmitted to Lieutenant Martinez, his voice carrying the controlled concern that marked professional pilots acknowledging potential problems. "My inputs seem to be delayed by a fraction of a second. Nothing dangerous, but definitely not normal aircraft behavior." Martinez was dealing with similar issues, as she attempted to execute a defensive barrel roll that required precise timing to avoid simulated enemy fire. Her Super Hornet was responding to control commands, but with timing characteristics that felt foreign compared to the thousands of hours she had logged in similar aircraft under similar conditions. "Viper Lade, I'm seeing the same thing," Martinez confirmed while fighting to maintain tactical formation despite her aircraft's unusual handling characteristics. "Control response feels mushy during extreme maneuvering, like there's some kind of processing delay between stick inputs and actual aircraft movement." In the maintenance control center at Miramar, Juliet's monitoring screens were painting an increasingly alarming picture of flight control system performance that validated every concern she had raised about the software modifications. The microsecond delays she had predicted were accumulating exactly as her analysis had suggested, creating response lag that was beginning to affect pilot control authority during the most demanding phases of the training exercise. "Chief Patterson, we need to contact Viper Flight immediately," Juliet announced with urgent professionalism as she tracked flight control data showing dangerous trends. "The control system delays are approaching critical thresholds. If pilots encounter emergency situations requiring immediate aircraft response, they may not have the control authority necessary for successful recovery." Chief Warrant Officer Patterson moved to Juliet's workstation to examine the telemetry data she was monitoring, his experienced eye immediately recognizing patterns that suggested developing problems despite the technically normal system status being reported by the aircraft's onboard computers. The flight control delays that Juliet had identified were subtle enough to avoid triggering automated warning systems, but significant enough to compromise pilot effectiveness during critical situations. "Parks, what specific recommendations do you have for the flight?" Patterson asked as he studied the real-time performance data streaming from Thompson's squadron. "The pilots are reporting control anomalies, but all aircraft systems show green status. How do we advise them to compensate for problems that their instruments aren't detecting?" Juliet's response drew on knowledge and experience that went far beyond routine maintenance training, though she carefully phrased her recommendations in terms that wouldn't reveal the true source of her expertise. Her understanding of how pilots could adapt to degraded flight control systems was based on personal experience that her current assignment required her to keep hidden. "Chief, recommend that Viper Flight reduce maneuvering aggressiveness and increase anticipation time for all control inputs," Juliet advised, with the confidence of someone who understood both the technical problems and their operational implications. "The delays are most pronounced during high-G maneuvers at altitude. If they encounter emergency situations, they'll need to begin recovery procedures earlier than normal to compensate for system lag." Meanwhile, 35,000 feet above the Pacific, the training exercise was reaching its most challenging phase, as Thompson's squadron attempted to execute a complex defensive maneuver called a quote-unquote defensive wheel that required all 4 aircraft to coordinate their movements with split-second precision. The maneuver demanded immediate aircraft response to pilot inputs, exactly the kind of flying that made the flight control delays most dangerous. "Viper Flight, execute defensive wheel on my mark," Thompson commanded as simulated enemy aircraft closed to weapons range. 3, 2, 1, mark! The 4 Super Hornets began the coordinated maneuver that should have been executed with the clockwork precision that marked elite naval aviation training. But instead of the smooth, synchronized movement that the pilots expected, the formation began to develop dangerous spacing issues as individual aircraft responded to control inputs at slightly different rates due to the accumulated delays in their flight control systems. Lieutenant Cobra Davis, flying in the number 4 position, found himself dangerously close to Martinez's aircraft, as his Super Hornet failed to respond quickly enough to his defensive maneuvering inputs. The near collision forced him to execute emergency separation procedures that placed additional stress on flight control systems that were already operating at degraded performance levels. "Viper Lead Cobra 4 is experiencing significant control problems," Davis transmitted with the controlled urgency that marked pilots facing genuine emergencies. "I'm having trouble maintaining formation position due to delayed aircraft response. Request immediate clearance to independent maneuvering until I can assess my aircraft status." "Ha! Thompson authorized Davis to break formation while simultaneously dealing with his own escalating control problems, as the training exercise continued to demand the kind of aggressive flying that revealed the full extent of the flight control system degradation. His Super Hornet was becoming increasingly difficult to fly with the precision that combat situations required. "Hawk Control, this is Viper Lead," Thompson transmitted to Commander Sullivan in the air traffic control tower. "We're experiencing flight control anomalies across multiple aircraft in the formation. Request permission to terminate the training exercise and return to base for immediate maintenance assessment." Commander Sullivan received Thompson's transmission with the professional calm that marked experienced air traffic controllers dealing with potential emergency situations. Her 22 years of naval aviation experience had taught her to recognize when routine problems might escalate into genuine safety hazards, and the reports of multiple aircraft experiencing similar control issues suggested systematic problems rather than isolated mechanical failures. "Viper Lead, you are cleared to terminate training exercise and return to base," Sullivan responded immediately. "Be advised that maintenance control has been monitoring your flight and has specific recommendations for managing your aircraft during approach and landing procedures." In the Maintenance Control Center, Chief Patterson established direct communication with Thompson's formation to provide the technical guidance that Juliet's analysis had prepared them to offer. The conversation that followed would mark the first time that Juliet's expertise would be directly available to pilots dealing with the exact problem she had predicted. "Viper Flight, this is Miramar Maintenance Control," Patterson transmitted. "We've been monitoring flight control system performance and have identified the source of your handling problems. The recent software modifications have created cumulative delays in control system response that become most apparent during high-stress maneuvering." Thompson's relief at receiving official confirmation of the problems his squadron was experiencing was tempered by growing concern about how the control issues might affect their ability to land safely at Miramar. The approach and landing phase would require the kind of precise aircraft control that the flight control delays were making increasingly difficult to achieve. "Maintenance control, what specific procedures do we need to follow to compensate for these control delays?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying the professional focus that marked experienced pilots seeking technical guidance during emergency situations. Patterson turned to Juliet, recognizing that her understanding of the flight control problems went beyond routine technical knowledge and might provide insights that could ensure successful recovery of the squadron. The moment represented the first time that military hierarchy would officially acknowledge Juliet's superior expertise in a critical situation. "Parks," Patterson said quietly, "you predicted these problems and you understand them better than anyone else. What do these pilots need to know to get their aircraft home safely?" Juliet stepped forward to the communication console, knowing that her response would draw on knowledge and experience that she had been required to keep hidden for months. But with 4 pilots and their aircraft at risk due to problems she had identified and unsuccessfully warned about, operational security concerns became secondary to flight safety. "Viper Flight, this is Parks from Maintenance Control," Juliet transmitted with the calm authority that marked someone comfortable providing technical guidance to pilots in emergency situations. "The control delays you're experiencing require specific compensation techniques during approach and landing. You'll need to begin all control inputs approximately 1/2 second earlier than normal, and avoid any rapid control movements that might exceed the system's ability to respond effectively." Thompson listened to Juliet's guidance with growing respect for the maintenance specialist whose warnings he had dismissed just hours earlier. Her understanding of the flight control problems clearly went beyond routine technical knowledge, and her confidence in providing operational guidance suggested experience that didn't match her apparent position in the maintenance hierarchy. The squadron's return to Miramar would test not only their ability to adapt to degraded aircraft systems, but also Thompson's willingness to trust technical expertise that came from sources he had previously underestimated. The quiet maintenance specialist, whose concerns had been politely dismissed, was about to demonstrate knowledge that could mean the difference between successful landing and potential disaster. The approach to Miramar Naval Air Station had never felt more challenging to Lieutenant Commander Thompson, as he fought to maintain precise control of his F-4/A-18 Super Hornet while dealing with flight control delays that made every input feel like operating through thick molasses. 25 miles out from the runway, his squadron was strung out in a loose formation as each pilot struggled with aircraft that responded to commands a split second later than their training and experience expected. Viper Flight, Miramar Tower, you are cleared for priority approach runway 14 left, came the transmission from Commander Sullivan, whose air traffic control experience told her that the reported flight control problems could turn a routine landing into a genuine emergency. Emergency crews are standing by as a precautionary measure. Report when you have the field in sight. Lieutenant Martinez, flying as Thompson's wingman, found herself constantly fighting to maintain proper spacing, as her Super Hornet's delayed responses created a continuous battle between her intentions and the aircraft's actual performance. The approach phase required constant minor adjustments that relied on immediate aircraft response, but the flight control delays were turning routine corrections into a complex prediction exercise. Viper lead Phoenix is having significant difficulty maintaining stable approach parameters, Martinez transmitted, her voice carrying the controlled tension that marked experienced pilots acknowledging serious problems. The control delays are making it almost impossible to execute the small corrections necessary for precision approach flying. In the Maintenance Control Center, Juliet monitored the squadron's approach with growing concern as telemetry data showed flight control system performance continuing to degrade under the stress of approach and landing procedures. Her analysis indicated that the delays were becoming more pronounced as pilots attempted the precise control inputs that safe landing required, creating a dangerous feedback loop that could overwhelm even experienced aviators. Chief Patterson, I recommend we establish continuous communication with Viper Flight during their approach, Juliet advised with the urgent professionalism that marked someone who understood exactly how dangerous the situation was becoming. The control delays will be most problematic during final approach and touchdown when pilots need immediate aircraft response for safe landing. Chief Warrant Officer Patterson recognized that Juliet's technical expertise was now the squadron's best resource for managing the emergency landing procedures that lay ahead. Her understanding of the flight control problems clearly exceeded routine maintenance knowledge, and her accurate predictions had established her credibility as someone whose guidance could prevent potential disasters. Parks, I'm putting you in direct communication with the pilots, Patterson decided, overriding normal protocols that limited maintenance personnel's interaction with flight operations. Your analysis has been accurate throughout this situation, and these pilots need technical guidance from someone who understands their problems better than anyone else. The decision represented a significant departure from standard military procedures, but emergency situations often required creative solutions that prioritized effectiveness over protocol. Patterson understood that Juliet possessed knowledge and expertise that could mean the difference between successful landings and potential catastrophe for Thompson's squadron. Viper Flight, this is Parks from Maintenance Control, Juliet transmitted with the calm authority that would characterize her guidance throughout the emergency landing sequence. I'll be talking you through approach procedures that compensate for the flight control delays you're experiencing. The key is anticipating your aircraft's responses and beginning control inputs earlier than your training normally requires. Thompson listened to Juliet's voice with a mixture of professional focus and personal realization that the maintenance specialist he had dismissed hours earlier possessed knowledge that was now essential for his squadron's safety. Her confidence in providing operational guidance suggested experience that went far beyond routine technical training, but his immediate concern was following her recommendations to ensure successful landings. Maintenance Control, Viper lead copies, Thompson responded, his voice reflecting the respect that emergency situations created for competent technical expertise regardless of its source. We're experiencing approximately half-second delays in aircraft response to control inputs. How do we compensate for this during final approach and landing? Juliet's response drew on knowledge that came from personal experience with similar aircraft under similar emergency conditions, though she carefully phrased her guidance in terms that wouldn't reveal the true source of her expertise. Her understanding of how to fly degraded aircraft systems was based on training and experience that her current assignment required her to keep hidden. Viper Flight, you'll need to begin all approach corrections approximately 1 second before you would normally execute them, Juliet instructed with the precision that marks someone who had successfully dealt with similar problems. Start your descent rate adjustments early, anticipate airspeed corrections, and avoid any rapid control movements that might exceed your system's ability to respond smoothly. Lieutenant Bulldog Williams, flying in the number 3 position, found himself struggling more than his squadron mates, as his aircraft's flight control delays seemed to be more pronounced than the problems affecting the other Super Hornets. His attempts to maintain proper approach speed and glide path were becoming increasingly difficult, as the delayed responses created oscillations that threatened to destabilize his entire approach. Viper lead Bulldog 3 is having major problems maintaining stable approach, Williams transmitted with the controlled urgency that marked pilots facing genuine emergencies. My control delays seem worse than the rest of the flight, and I'm getting pilot-induced oscillations that are making it difficult to maintain safe approach parameters. The report of varying control problems among different aircraft confirmed Juliet's analysis that the software modifications had affected individual aircraft differently based on their specific system configurations and usage patterns. Her monitoring data showed that Williams' aircraft was indeed experiencing more severe delays than the other Super Hornets, creating additional complications for the emergency landing procedures. Bulldog 3, this is Parks, Juliet transmitted directly to Williams with the focused attention that emergency situations demanded. Your aircraft is showing more pronounced delays than the others in your formation. You'll need to extend your approach timing even further and consider executing a go-around if you can't establish stable approach parameters by minimums. The recommendation to consider a go-around reflected Juliet's understanding that attempting to force a landing with severely degraded flight control systems could result in accidents that proper emergency procedures were designed to prevent. Her guidance was based on knowledge of aircraft limitations and pilot capabilities that came from extensive experience with similar emergency situations. Commander Sullivan, monitoring the emergency landing procedures from the air traffic control tower, made the decision to clear the airspace around Miramar and position emergency equipment for potential runway incidents. Her experience told her that multiple aircraft with flight control problems represented a higher than normal risk of landing accidents that required comprehensive emergency response preparation. All aircraft in Miramar airspace, this is tower control, Sullivan announced over the emergency frequency. Priority approach is in progress for aircraft experiencing flight control emergencies. All non-essential traffic is directed to hold at assigned altitudes until further notice. The first aircraft to attempt landing was Lieutenant Cobra Davis, whose Super Hornet had shown the most stable performance despite the flight control delays affecting his squadron. His approach would serve as a test case for the compensation procedures that Juliet had recommended, providing valuable information about how the degraded systems would behave during actual landing operations. Hangar. Cobra 4 on final approach, Davis transmitted as he began the critical phase of landing where precise aircraft control would determine the success or failure of his emergency procedures. Following Parks' recommendations for early control inputs and avoiding rapid corrections, Juliet monitored Davis's approach through her telemetry systems while simultaneously providing real-time guidance based on his aircraft's specific performance characteristics. Her ability to analyze flight data and provide immediate operational recommendations demonstrated expertise that went far beyond routine maintenance knowledge, though the source of that expertise remained carefully hidden. Cobra 4, your approach looks stable, but you're developing a slight sink rate that will require power adjustment in approximately 3 seconds, Juliet advised with the precise timing that marked someone who could predict aircraft behavior under degraded conditions. Begin power addition now to maintain proper glide path through touchdown. Davis followed Juliet's guidance and successfully landed his Super Hornet, though the touchdown was firmer than normal due to the flight control delays that made precise flare timing more difficult than usual. His successful landing proved that Juliet's compensation procedures were effective, but also demonstrated that each aircraft would require individual attention due to varying degrees of system degradation. Cobra 4 is safely on deck, Davis reported with relief evident in his voice. Parks' guidance was essential for successful landing. Her understanding of these control problems exceeded anything in our emergency procedures training. The successful landing of the first aircraft validated Juliet's technical expertise and established her credibility as someone whose knowledge could ensure the safe recovery of Thompson's remaining squadron members. But with 3 more aircraft still facing emergency landing procedures, the most challenging tests of her hidden capabilities were yet to come. Lieutenant Bulldog Williams was in serious trouble. His Super Hornet's flight control delays had worsened during the approach phase, creating a dangerous situation where his aircraft was responding to control inputs nearly a full second after he executed them. The delay was transforming routine landing procedures into a complex prediction exercise that threatened to overwhelm even his considerable flying skills as he struggled to maintain stable approach parameters. Viper-led Bulldog 3 is declaring an emergency, Williams transmitted, his voice carrying the controlled urgency that marked experienced pilots acknowledging life-threatening situations. My control delays have increased significantly, and I'm unable to maintain stable approach configuration. I may need to execute multiple approach attempts before I can achieve safe landing parameters. In the Maintenance Control Center, Juliet watched Williams' telemetry data with growing alarm as his aircraft's flight control system showed patterns that indicated near-complete degradation of normal response characteristics. The software modifications that had created minor delays in the other aircraft were manifesting as severe control problems in Williams' Super Hornet, creating an emergency that routine compensation procedures might not be able to address. Chief Patterson, Bulldog 3's control problems are beyond what normal emergency procedures can handle, Juliet announced with urgent professionalism as she analyzed real-time performance data. His aircraft is experiencing delays that make conventional landing techniques extremely dangerous. He's going to need specialized guidance based on techniques that aren't covered in standard pilot training. Chief Warrant Officer Patterson understood that Juliet's assessment meant Williams was facing the kind of emergency that tested the absolute limits of pilot skill and aircraft capability. Her technical expertise had already proven essential for the squadron's emergency landing procedures, but Williams' situation would require knowledge and experience that went beyond routine maintenance specialization. "Parks, what kind of specialized techniques are we talking about?" Patterson asked, recognizing that her answer might reveal capabilities that exceeded her apparent qualifications. If standard emergency procedures won't work for Williams, what alternatives do we have? Juliet hesitated for a moment, understanding that her response would necessarily draw on knowledge and experience that her current assignment required her to keep hidden. But with Williams' life at stake, and his aircraft approaching the point where successful landing might become impossible, operational security concerns became secondary to flight safety. "Chief, I need to talk directly to Bulldog 3 using guidance techniques that aren't in any manual," Juliet replied with quiet intensity. "His control delays require compensation methods that can only be learned through personal experience with severely degraded aircraft systems under emergency conditions." The statement hung in the air as Patterson and the other maintenance personnel in the control center processed the implications of what Juliet had just revealed. Her reference to personal experience with emergency flight procedures suggested knowledge that maintenance specialists shouldn't possess, indicating background and training that went far beyond her apparent position in the squadron's support structure. "Bulldog 3, this is Parks from Maintenance Control," Juliet transmitted directly to Williams with the calm authority that marked someone comfortable providing critical guidance during life-threatening emergencies. "I'm going to talk you through landing procedures that compensate for severe flight control degradation. You'll need to trust my instructions completely, because the techniques I'm going to teach you aren't covered in conventional pilot training." Williams, fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that was becoming increasingly unresponsive to his inputs, listened to Juliet's voice with the desperate focus that emergency situations created. Her confidence in providing specialized flight guidance suggested expertise that went far beyond routine technical knowledge, but his immediate concern was following her recommendations to achieve successful landing. "Maintenance Control Bulldog 3 copies," Williams responded, his voice reflecting the trust that pilots placed in competent technical expertise during critical situations. "I'm ready to follow any procedures that will get this aircraft safely on the ground. My normal training isn't working with these control delays." Lieutenant Commander Thompson, who had been monitoring Williams' emergency while managing his own approach procedures, found himself listening to Juliet's guidance with growing amazement. Her understanding of advanced flight techniques clearly exceeded anything that maintenance training could provide, suggesting experience and knowledge that didn't match her position in the squadron's organizational structure. "Bulldog 3, you're going to use a technique called predictive control that compensates for severe system delays," Juliet instructed with the precision that marked someone who had successfully used similar procedures under comparable conditions. "Instead of reacting to what your aircraft is doing now, you'll need to anticipate what it will be doing 2 to 3 seconds in the future and make control inputs based on those predictions." The guidance that Juliet was providing represented knowledge that only a small number of test pilots and experimental aviators would possess, techniques that were developed during aircraft development programs, and extreme emergency situations that pushed both pilots and machines beyond their normal operational limits. Her familiarity with such procedures indicated background and experience that her personnel file didn't acknowledge. Master Chief Johnson, who had been monitoring the emergency procedures from his position in the maintenance bay, approached the control center with growing realization that the quiet specialist he had supervised for months possessed capabilities that fundamentally changed his understanding of her qualifications and background. "Chief Patterson," Johnson said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had reached an important conclusion about circumstances he had previously misunderstood. "Parks isn't just a maintenance specialist, is she? The kind of knowledge she's demonstrating doesn't come from technical training or maintenance experience." Patterson nodded grimly as he watched Juliet guide Williams through emergency procedures that revealed expertise no enlisted maintenance specialist should possess. Her understanding of advanced flight techniques and her confidence in providing critical operational guidance suggested qualifications that had been deliberately hidden for reasons that were beginning to become apparent. Bulldog 3, begin your flare approximately 8 seconds before normal timing. Juliet continued her guidance, her voice carrying the calm certainty that marked someone who had personally executed similar procedures under comparable conditions. The control delays mean your aircraft won't respond to flare inputs until you're almost at touchdown. Start the maneuver while you're still 50 feet above the runway. Williams followed Juliet's instructions with the precision that emergency situations demanded, executing landing procedures that contradicted everything his pilot training had taught him, but which compensated perfectly for his aircraft's degraded flight control systems. The technique required him to trust guidance from someone whose expertise he was only beginning to understand. Maintenance control, the predictive control technique, is working, Williams reported, as his Super Hornet responded to the unconventional landing procedures. This is unlike anything I learned in flight training, but it's allowing me to maintain stable approach despite the severe control delays. Lieutenant Martinez, who was next in the landing sequence, listened to the exchange between Williams and Juliet with growing respect for the maintenance specialist whose knowledge was proving essential for her squadron's survival. The techniques being demonstrated suggested experience with aircraft emergencies that went far beyond routine support operations. "Parks, Phoenix here," Martinez transmitted during a brief lull in Williams' landing sequence. "Your guidance procedures are incredibly sophisticated. Where did you learn emergency techniques that aren't covered in standard naval aviation training?" The question represented the direct inquiry that Juliet had been expecting since her expertise became openly apparent during the emergency landing procedures. Her answer would necessarily reveal information about her background and qualifications that her current assignment had required her to keep hidden, but the circumstances no longer allowed for maintaining operational security at the expense of flight safety. "Phoenix, I learned these techniques during my previous assignment as a Navy test pilot," Juliet replied with quiet honesty, her words carrying the weight of revelation that transformed everyone's understanding of her identity and capabilities. "My current maintenance assignment is operational cover for security reasons that I'm not authorized to discuss." The admission sent shockwaves through both the maintenance control center and the aircraft still attempting emergency landings. The quiet specialist, who had been dismissed as an overcautious technician, was revealing herself as one of the Navy's most qualified experimental aviators, someone whose expertise with emergency flight procedures exceeded that of anyone currently in the squadron. "Bulldog 3 is safely on deck," Williams announced as his Super Hornet touched down successfully using the predictive control techniques that Juliet had taught him. Parks' guidance was absolutely essential for successful landing. Her knowledge of emergency procedures saved my life and my aircraft. The successful landing marked a turning point in how Thompson and his remaining pilots viewed the woman who had tried to warn them about the flight control problems hours earlier. The maintenance specialist, whose concerns had been politely dismissed, was revealing herself as someone whose flying expertise exceeded their own, someone whose hidden qualifications had positioned her to provide the technical support that was proving essential for their survival. As Thompson prepared for his own emergency landing, he found himself confronting the magnitude of his misjudgment about Juliet's capabilities and the assumptions that had led him to dismiss warnings from someone who possessed superior knowledge of the aircraft systems and emergency procedures that were now determining the success or failure of his squadron's return to base. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's approach to Miramar represented more than just an emergency landing procedure. It was a moment of reckoning with assumptions and judgments that had nearly cost his squadron their lives. With 2 aircraft safely on deck thanks to the guidance of the woman he had dismissed as an overcautious mechanic, Thompson found himself preparing to trust someone whose true expertise he was only beginning to understand. "Viper Lead, this is Commander Juliet Parks," came the voice through his headset, and even in the midst of his emergency approach, Thompson noticed the subtle change in how she identified herself. No longer Parks from Maintenance Control, but Commander Parks, revealing a rank that placed her senior to him in the naval hierarchy and explaining the confidence that had marked all her technical assessments. "Commander Parks, Viper Lead ready to copy approach guidance," Thompson replied, his voice carrying a mixture of professional respect and personal humility that reflected his growing understanding of how completely he had misjudged the situation. "My aircraft is showing similar control delays to the others, but I'm prepared to follow your emergency procedures." The revelation of Juliet's true rank had sent ripples of shock through the maintenance control center, where personnel who had worked alongside her for months were suddenly confronting the reality that their colleague was actually one of the Navy's most senior experimental pilots. Master Chief Johnson stood quietly, processing the implications of having supervised someone who significantly outranked him, while Chief Patterson realized that every technical recommendation Juliet had made carried the authority of extensive flight test experience. Viper-led, your aircraft is showing more stable control characteristics than Bulldog 3 experienced, Juliet transmitted with the calm professionalism that had characterized all her guidance during the emergency. You'll need to use the predictive control techniques I described, but with less extreme timing adjustments. Begin your control inputs approximately half a second earlier than normal training procedures. As Thompson executed his approach using Juliet's guidance, Lieutenant Martinez prepared for her own landing while listening to radio exchanges that were transforming her understanding of naval aviation hierarchy and the assumptions that had guided her career. The quiet maintenance specialist who had endured months of condescending treatment was revealing herself as someone whose qualifications exceeded those of anyone in their squadron. Commander Parks, Phoenix requesting clarification on my approach procedures, Martinez transmitted, her use of Juliet's proper rank reflecting the respect that the revelation of her true identity demanded. My aircraft seems to be responding better than the others. Should I modify the predictive control timing you've recommended? Juliet's response drew on knowledge gained through years of test flying experience that had exposed her to every conceivable combination of aircraft problems and emergency procedures. Her ability to analyze individual aircraft performance and provide customized guidance represented expertise that came from pushing experimental aircraft beyond their design limits under controlled conditions. Phoenix, your flight control delays are less severe than the others, Juliet advised with the precision that marked her technical assessments. Use standard approach timing but monitor your control responses carefully. If you notice any increase in delays during final approach, immediately switch to the predictive control techniques. The successful landing of Thompson's Super Hornet marked the completion of emergency procedures that had tested every aspect of pilot skill, aircraft capability, and technical expertise available to the squadron. As his aircraft rolled to a stop on Miramar's runway, Thompson found himself reflecting on the series of assumptions and misjudgments that had nearly resulted in disaster for his entire formation. Viper lead is safely on deck, Thompson announced, his voice carrying relief that went beyond simple mission completion. Commander Parks, your guidance was essential for successful recovery of this squadron. Your expertise saved 4 aircraft and 4 pilots who should have listened to your warnings from the beginning. The admission represented more than professional acknowledgement of technical competence. It was a personal recognition of the prejudices and assumptions that had led him to dismiss warnings from someone whose qualifications far exceeded his own. Thompson's apology carried the weight of someone confronting the limitations of his judgment and the dangerous consequences of his misconceptions. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's approach to Miramar represented more than just an emergency landing procedure. It was a moment of reckoning with assumptions and judgments that had nearly cost his squadron their lives. With 2 aircraft safely on deck thanks to the guidance of the woman he had dismissed as an overcautious mechanic, Thompson found himself preparing to trust someone whose true expertise he was only beginning to understand. Viper lead, this is Commander Juliet Parks, came the voice through his headset, and even in the midst of his emergency approach, Thompson noticed the subtle change in how she identified herself. No longer Parks from maintenance control, but Commander Parks, revealing a rank that placed her senior to him in the naval hierarchy, and explaining the confidence that had marked all her technical assessments. Commander Parks, Viper lead ready to copy approach guidance, Thompson replied, his voice carrying a mixture of professional respect and personal humility that reflected his growing understanding of how completely he had misjudged the situation. My aircraft is showing similar control delays to the others, but I'm prepared to follow your emergency procedures. The revelation of Juliet's true rank had sent ripples of shock through the maintenance control center, where personnel who had worked alongside her for months were suddenly confronting the reality that their colleague was actually one of the Navy's most senior experimental pilots. Master Chief Johnson stood quietly processing the implications of having supervised someone who significantly outranked him, while Chief Patterson realized that every technical recommendation Juliet had made carried the authority of extensive flight test experience. Viper-led, your aircraft is showing more stable control characteristics than Bulldog 3 experienced, Juliet transmitted with the calm professionalism that had characterized all her guidance during the emergency. You'll need to use the predictive control techniques I described, but with less extreme timing adjustments. Begin your control inputs approximately half a second earlier than normal training procedures. As Thompson executed his approach using Juliet's guidance, Lieutenant Martinez prepared for her own landing while listening to radio exchanges that were transforming her understanding of naval aviation hierarchy and the assumptions that had guided her career. The quiet maintenance specialist who had endured months of condescending treatment was revealing herself as someone whose qualifications exceeded those of anyone in their squadron. "Commander Parks, Phoenix requesting clarification on my approach procedures," Martinez transmitted, her use of Juliet's proper rank reflecting the respect that the revelation of her true identity demanded. "My aircraft seems to be responding better than the others. Should I modify the predictive control timing you've recommended?" Juliet's response drew on knowledge gained through years of test flying experience that had exposed her to every conceivable combination of aircraft problems and emergency procedures. Her ability to analyze individual aircraft performance and provide customized guidance represented expertise that came from pushing experimental aircraft beyond their design limits under controlled conditions. "Phoenix, your flight control delays are less severe than the others," Juliet advised with the precision that marked her technical assessments. "Use standard approach timing but monitor your control responses carefully. If you notice any increase in delays during final approach, immediately switch to the predictive control techniques." The successful landing of Thompson's Super Hornet marked the completion of emergency procedures that had tested every aspect of pilot skill, aircraft capability, and technical expertise available to the squadron. As his aircraft rolled to a stop on Miramar's runway, Thompson found himself reflecting on the series of assumptions and misjudgments that had nearly resulted in disaster for his entire formation. "Viper lead is safely on deck," Thompson announced, his voice carrying relief that went beyond simple mission completion. "Commander Parks, your guidance was essential for successful recovery of this squadron. Your expertise saved 4 aircraft and 4 pilots who should have listened to your warnings from the beginning." The admission represented more than professional acknowledgement of technical competence. It was a personal recognition of the prejudices and assumptions that had led him to dismiss warnings from someone whose qualifications far exceeded his own. Thompson's apology carried the weight of someone confronting the limitations of his judgment and the dangerous consequences of his misconceptions. As the debriefing concluded and squadron personnel prepared to return to their regular duties, the impact of the day's events would continue to influence how they approached their responsibilities and evaluated the contributions of their colleagues. The maintenance specialist they had known as Parks had been revealed as Commander Parks, a test pilot whose hidden expertise had saved their lives and transformed their understanding of competence, hierarchy, and the dangerous consequences of assumptions. The woman they had called Ghost Mechanic had proven that true expertise often worked quietly in the background, unrecognized, until crisis demanded that hidden capabilities be revealed. Her story would become legend at Miramar, a reminder that competence and leadership could emerge from unexpected sources, and that the most valuable people were often those who contributed essential work without seeking recognition or credit for their extraordinary capabilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.